Washington, D.C.
Tonight, foreign policy focus. President Trump holds high-stakes meetings with Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu and Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The White House calls Trump's meeting with Netanyahu positive and productive as the president plays down the prospect of further escalation with Iran. Netanyahu's spokesman says the two leaders remain fully aligned and Israel will support whichever path Trump chooses. Plus, sanctions showdown. Zelenskyy heads to Capitol Hill tonight following his closed-door meeting with President Trump as the Senate is set for a key procedural vote on sanctions legislation targeting Russia and Iran, a bill championed by the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Former Vice President Mike Pence will join us live this hour on the challenges facing Trump abroad and the future of Graham's hawkish foreign policy legacy. And we'll talk more about Graham's legacy as Washington says farewell to Senator Graham, with lawmakers and world leaders gathering to honor one of Congress's most forceful voices on foreign policy.
In a city where politicians often become jaded and cynical, Lindsey Graham never lost the old-fashioned American idealism that brought him to the highest levels of government and life. Above all, Lindsey Graham loved America, and he believed in the American people. If you shared that view, you had a friend in Lindsey. If you didn't share it, there was no fiercer or more constant opponent.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kayleigh Lyons alongside Joe Matthew.
We begin this evening, Kayleigh, with Washington saying farewell to the late Senator Graham. A solemn day of tributes began at the Capitol earlier today with Graham's colleagues honoring him in a public ceremony before moving on to the National Cathedral. Their friends, family, foreign leaders paid final respects, including President Trump, as you just saw, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The day also brought movement on one of Graham's final legislative priorities as a bipartisan group of senators reached a deal on a new sanctions package targeting Russia and Iran. We begin now our coverage this hour at the White House with Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who is standing on the North Lawn. Kate, we know the president is back at the White House today. This was an interesting moment for him to eulogize his friend Lindsey Graham, who at one time was an opponent. What did it mean for the president?
That's right. So Senator Graham ended up being one of the president's most outspoken allies in the Senate. They were frequently in touch. They were longtime friends. He was an advisor to the president, particularly on foreign policy issues. So we heard the president eulogize the late Senator Graham today and really reflect on his life and his public service and really reflecting on their friendship. The president said he noted that the two did not always agree on policy. He said that the Graham was truly hawkish. He never saw a war that he didn't like. He also talked about the very beginning of their relationship and noted that it got off to a pretty rocky start when they ran against each other in the 2016 presidential Republican primary. He recalled a time when Graham at the time was very critical of President Trump, and he recalled a time when he gave out Graham's personal cell phone number at a campaign event and said basically that Graham's phone exploded after that happened. But as you noted, the president was there today, the vice president. We saw foreign leaders, Netanyahu was there, Zelenskyy, as well as, of course, several lawmakers and other members of the cabinet.
Well, you mentioned Netanyahu and Zelenskyy in attendance before they made tracks to the National Cathedral. They were at the White House meeting with President Trump, each of them separately and privately. Kate, what do we know about what was discussed?
So it was interesting. Reporters were not allowed into either of those meetings, and which isn't completely unusual. This has happened before, but the president typically likes to bring reporters, members of the media in for at least a few moments at the top of these meetings. But these were completely closed press. They said that they were working diplomatic meetings. We have not heard much from the White House yet on what actually happened. We haven't heard from the president himself, who, of course, spent all afternoon at the funeral service for Senator Lindsey Graham. But the Caroline Leavitt said that the meetings were positive and productive. We've heard from both foreign leaders. We've heard from both Zelenskyy and Netanyahu about their meetings. Zelenskyy said that they talked about Patriot interceptors and trying to restart diplomatic relations. I think the Netanyahu meeting was particularly interesting. It's coming at a time where there are some signs of tension between the president and the prime minister on the war in Iran. This was Netanyahu's first trip to Washington since the war, since the U.S. and Israel together launched this war against Iran in February. So it's coming at a very delicate moment. It's also coming at a time when the U.S. is saying that they're trying to give diplomacy a chance. The president, of course, has had a very on-again, off-again approach to diplomacy and launching strikes. But at this moment, the president saying that he is looking to really try out the diplomatic process for now.
All right, Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live at the White House for us. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more is Evelyn Farkas, the executive director of the McCain Institute and former deputy assistant secretary of defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia during the Obama administration. Evelyn, welcome back to Bloomberg. We want to get to the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and the U.S. and Iran. But if we could first reflect on the legacy of Senator Graham, who had very close relationships with President Trump, yes, but with Netanyahu and Zelenskyy as well, acted in many ways as a liaison between those countries and the White House. Is there anyone who can take up that mantle now?
Well, Kayleigh, that's a really good question. I don't see an immediate successor because Senator Graham was really a unique individual. He had this charming, funny way about him, and he was really consistent when it came to his support for frontline democracies like Ukraine, Taiwan, other countries. And he did have a way of convincing President Trump to not completely flip sides and go over to the Russian side and to listen to his arguments when it came to support for Ukraine. So he will be missed. I think his colleagues are obviously doing the best thing they can do to pay tribute to the late senator, which is to pass the sanctions legislation that you mentioned earlier.
Well, it is a remarkable confluence of events here. If life is all about timing, this is the day, Evelyn, to have all of these people in one room memorializing Lindsey Graham, helping to potentially inflate the vote count for this sanctions package. We know it's going to pass. Unlikely we'll receive the unanimous consent agreement that some were hoping for. But what might this mean for the trajectory of the actual war in Ukraine?
Well, Joe, it means that there's an opportunity now for President Trump to really put more economic pressure on Russia. We've seen, of course, Ukraine putting increasing military pressure on Russia through the long-range drone strikes that they've conducted, hitting oil refineries, hitting supply logistics chains to Crimea, for example. But this now means that we can pressure the Russians where it really hurts and where they're very vulnerable, which is cash flow. They need money to supply their weaponry to pay people. They actually have a real labor problem and they have a war economy. So cutting off the flow of oil revenue to Russia will make an impact. And the way that these sanctions are devised, the president will have to impose them. He'll also have to report to Congress. There was a lot of strengthening that was done behind the scenes while Lindsey Graham was alive and then even afterwards.
Well, you mentioned the president would have to impose them. Sanctions are only effective if enforced, Evelyn. You have confidence these would be?
Well, Kayleigh, I do think they will be better enforced than they have been in the past, and it won't be entirely up to the United States. So we will see the Europeans taking advantage of this as well. There are some loopholes for the Europeans because, of course, they still get some oil from Russia and gas, but the amounts are lower. They're below the threshold, so they won't be hit by the sanctions, but they'll be motivated to take action to demonstrate, because in line with this legislation, they have to demonstrate that they are trying to reduce their dependence on Russia. So overall, it's good news, and it does provide President Trump with an opportunity, something that he can use as he pushes for diplomacy.
Evelyn, it's not lost on us what good friends John McCain and Lindsey Graham were. Of course, Joe Lieberman was the third musketeer, if you want to complete the picture here. But I'm quite sure that John McCain would have some pretty strong feelings about seeing this legislation now formally named the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia Act. What would he have thought?
I think he would be very proud of his friend. You know, he didn't always agree with him, obviously. The late Senator McCain never supported President Trump, and President Trump insulted the late senator. Nevertheless, he would very much approve of and, be supportive of the fact that Senator Graham maintained his adherence to the principles of sovereignty, the human rights, the need to defend Ukraine. And so I know that Senator McCain obviously would be wholeheartedly in support of this. He would probably say something like, it's about time, this is long overdue, because he was a kind of guy to be pushing forward for more. And I'm sure he would have wanted more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this bill does include more than was initially drafted. It has expanded, Evelyn, to encompass potential sanctions pertaining to Iran as well. And as we consider the state of play with Iran, we obviously have seen no shots fired, no strikes that the U.S. has conducted since Friday. It seems that there is the pursuit of peace once again through diplomatic negotiations. Would you put much faith in the process this time around after they've been unsuccessful in previous rounds?
Well, Kayleigh, I think we're going to have to be patient here, and it's not going to be just diplomacy. I think the United States, our allies and partners, we're going to have to put economic pressure, frankly, on Iran. The military instrument alone clearly isn't working. If we can put economic pressure on Iran by squeezing off their ability to trade, by harming their economy, eventually they will have to come to the negotiating table. And they think that they can outweigh President Trump. I think that our goal should be really to outweigh them. So keep on pushing forward with diplomacy, with economic pressure, with maybe limited strikes if they're necessary. But I think at this point, our military, has spoken to President Trump, according to media reports, and they've said that the military effort isn't succeeding. And in fact, it's, of course, costing us a lot of money and depleting our reserves.
Zelenskyy was not the only meeting, the only world leader the president met with today, Evelyn. Benjamin Netanyahu was also at the White House. And while reporters were not invited in the room for either meeting, we did hear from a spokesperson from the prime minister, obviously with the interest of making this look like a productive meeting. Israel supports whatever path Trump chooses. Interesting headline. As we also heard from that individual that the U.S. and Israel are fully aligned on Iran. Is the latter headline true? And if that's the case, why would Israel have to follow the U.S. on whatever the president chooses?
Right, Joe, you are spelling out the contradiction here. We are not fully aligned with Israel when it comes to objectives. Right now, President Trump, the United States, wants to open the Strait of Hormuz. That's our primary objective. For Israel, that's not the primary objective. Israel wants to weaken the Iranian regime permanently, and they want to also make sure that Iran no longer has the ability to recreate, to rebuild their nuclear weapons program. The first one is what President Trump is focused on, and he can negotiate probably some kind of deal. The second two are harder to achieve. And so Israel wants to keep the military pressure on while we want to take the military pressure off, as I just explained, because we don't think it was causing us to be able to achieve that objective. So they are in contradiction. But what I will say is, of course, and I think you hinted at this, Prime Minister Netanyahu needed to come out of this meeting, at least showing to the Israeli people that he still had the backing of President Trump and the United States.
All right, Evelyn, thank you so much. It's great to have you back, as always.
Thanks, guys.
Coming up on Bloomberg, a chip sell-off sends the NASDAQ down near correction territory as the semiconductor rout continues, with investors questioning the amount of AI dollars big tech is spending. We'll have that and more in Power Moves up next. This is Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kayleigh Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. To a Bloomberg scoop now, OpenAI and Anthropic employees are circulating a petition that calls on the Trump administration to back a system to deliberately pace AI development and keep it from advancing too fast. This after OpenAI disclosed it had mistakenly hacked another company's internal system. We should note Sam Altman's in town tomorrow. And it was a volatile day as we turn to Wall Street for chip stocks, with the Dow and the S&P 500 closing higher as oil's decline outweighed yet another down day for semiconductors. And that helped to pull the Nasdaq to the brink of correction territory. We turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who's live in New York. Nora?
A rotation in the market out of tech and into some of those economically sensitive sectors here in New York City. We did see the Nasdaq 100 lower by 1%, actually sitting just near correction territory. We also did see a drag of tech companies on the S&P 500. So we saw the S&P 500 ending higher by just 0.2%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, though, the outperformer, up by 1%. But digging a bit deeper into those chip stocks, which we know were the biggest drag on the market, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index lower by about 4.5%. Some of those biggest weights going to Micron, down almost 9%, AMD falling 8%. A lot of questions about this AI spending and where we're really seeing the tech story going next. And in the bond market, we did see a third straight day of declines in bond yields, not really providing a breather to the Nasdaq, those declines that we saw there, and keeping an eye on oil. So the conversation still continues about what's going on in the Middle East and whether or not we are seeing traders actually pricing in some de-escalation there between the U.S. and Iran. Brent crude in focus, hanging around $84 a barrel. And this is actually the worst three-day stretch that we've seen for Brent crude since 2020. Attention now turning tomorrow toward the Fed and some of those big tech earnings that we're all waiting to digest.
Yeah, so let's talk about those. Nora, there's a number of heavyweights reporting after the bell. What are we going to be watching for most closely?
Well, we're going to get reports out of Meta, Microsoft, Qualcomm, those three companies reporting tomorrow after the closing bell. These are among the $24 trillion worth of S&P 500 companies that are reporting earnings this week. The question will continue to be about that AI spend when we think about hyperscalers and whether or not tech valuations have run too far, too fast. That's what investors will really be scrutinizing in and seeing what is going on with CapEx and where we see the story continuing forward here.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda in New York. Thank you so much. And as Nora mentioned, it is Fed week. The FOMC gathered today and will have a decision tomorrow, the second one under the new chairman, Kevin Warsh, amid a flurry of economic activity that has had economists and analysts debating whether the Fed will hold rates steady or potentially hike them in an effort to control inflation. And joining us now for more is Jared Bernstein, the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden White House. Jared, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We saw a note out from Citadel today that suggested that the Fed may actually go ahead and hike tomorrow to send a signal about their willingness to fight inflation, and one could argue potentially lend some credibility to the new chairman. Would you be surprised to see that?
I would be. I haven't checked the market probabilities for the last 5 minutes, but when I checked earlier, the likelihood of a hike was somewhere around a third. That's, of course, a lot higher than it's been. And the fact that the Fed has missed its target not for a month or two, but for 5 years running, definitely does strike at the potential credibility. We know how deeply the FOMC values the inflation anchor, and you got to kind of earn that anchor by backing your words up with actions. That said, we don't have an economy that's overheating. I think that's clear, whether we're looking at growth rates, the job market, certainly wage growth, which is last seen nominally around 3.5%. That's not putting inflationary pressures on the table. And at the same time, the inflation that we have is at least 2/3 a function of supply shocks having to do with what I would call pretty terrible policy, the tariffs and the war, the other being more of a demand story from AI. So mixed bag, but I expect the Fed to hold, and I think that would be the right decision, along with a much more hawkish stance in the statement.
Well, Jared, you read the client note from Citadel, and it says a quarter-point increase on Wednesday would reinforce Warsh's repeated pledge to restore price stability while showing policymakers no longer rely on signaling every policy move in advance, which is what he was said to have wanted. This would also keep him from having to hike closer to the election. Would it be wrong for him to do so?
Your last point is a really interesting one. I mean, how close is too close? So we're now about 3 months out from the midterms, and certainly there would be spitballs thrown from the White House if he did in fact do what
it might be either way.
Yeah, they might be either way, which would sort of lead you to have a bit more of a holding bias, I guess. My personal view is that we're probably too close to an election to jump either way. And again, I think given the economics and the fact that a good chunk of the inflation is the kind of supply side shocks that the Fed, I think reasonably can argue it looks through, there is an argument for holding. But look, I'm sympathetic to the argument that at this point, one of the most important functions that the Fed has to control inflation, which is anchored expectations, is under probably more threat than you'd see from looking at market indicators of expectations, which have been pretty tame. So look, if I'm wrong and the Fed does hike tomorrow, probably about a third chance of that, I won't criticize them for doing so. I just think it's not that likely.
Well, so it's not that likely. And to your point about it being a supply side issue that they're trying to address, potentially not as effective, Jared, unless it sends the proper signal to markets about the willingness to fight inflation, and therefore it has an effect on inflation expectations?
That's exactly right. So let's unpack that a little bit, because now we're into some sort of monetary macroeconomics. So the basis points on inflation that a supply shock adds is way more than the basis points off of inflation that you get from a point higher unemployment. This is kind of the old flat Phillips curve argument. And once you're out of the pandemic kinds of story where the Phillips curve went heavily nonlinear because of strong demand colliding with weak supply, you really have to jack the unemployment rate up a lot to move the inflation rate. And most of those BIPs, those basis points that are adding to inflation, are coming from the supply side. Again, AI demand is in the mix as well, and that's a legitimate demand side problem. So the Fed can't fight that part very effectively. What can they do, and why is that Citadel note at least somewhat resonant with me? They can do precisely what you just said, which is that they can say, we are serious about protecting the inflation anchor. We're not particularly assuaged by market indicators that suggest inflation expectations remain well anchored. We recognize that it's been far too long, and we're tired of saying it's this exception, it's that exception, it's this supply shock, it's that supply shock. No, we have to act. And I think that's a legitimate view. I just don't see it as pressing, coming into effect, as soon as tomorrow.
The data center is the new inflation boogeyman, Jared, and I'm wondering if the concerns that we're hearing about people's electric bills and availability when it comes to water and other resources are founded. In fact, we keep talking with developers and other stakeholders who say that we've got a closed circuit. We've got our own power off the grid. We're recycling water. Some legislation, in fact, demands that. Is this the new cause for fighting inflation?
From what I've seen, the fear of data center spillovers, it's not completely imagined by a lot of communities. Yeah. There's some evidence that they're paying higher electric bills. By the way, also here in Virginia, where I sit today, that is somewhat of reality. But many of the centers are providing their own electricity, and basically the industry is doing a terrible job of assuaging people and a great job of making them more anxious. I saw a statistic the other day that 80% of the Chinese are excited about AI compared to 20% of Americans. Policymakers have dropped the ball big time on this. Nobody is coming forth in the political sphere and saying, here is a plan to help you given these potential threats, whether it's your job, whether it's your kid's job with a newly minted college degree, or whether it's your electricity bill. And that's a real omission right now in the policy space.
Well, Jared, it's good to see you, and thanks for coming back. Jared Bernstein with us. Vice President Mike Pence, the former VP, is with us coming up next, only here on Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington, where respects were paid today to the late Senator of South Carolina, Lindsey Graham.
He was a fierce defender of Ukraine. He was a fierce defender of the unborn. And on the surface, these might seem like two completely separate issues. But it strikes me that in another way, they are both of a piece. In both cases, Lindsey Graham saw injustice, and he spoke up.
That's Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who spoke at a memorial service for the late Senator Lindsey Graham, reflecting on his commitment to Ukraine. Graham traveled to Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy just one day before his unexpected passing, with Zelenskyy repaying Graham's dedication to his country by traveling here to Washington for the senator's funeral today. He also met with President Trump at the White House. And joining us now is the former Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, longtime colleague of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, still a friend of President Zelenskyy, also author of the new book, What Conservatives Believe. Mr. Vice President, it's always great to have you with us at the desk, and good to see you today. You came to see us straight from the service, and we appreciate that. I know it's been an emotional day. I wonder if this is the clarifying moment that Ukraine needed to get Washington back on its side.
Well, first, thanks for simply acknowledging the life and service and legacy of Senator Lindsey Graham. America lost a great American statesman, but I lost a friend. I met him when I arrived on Capitol Hill 25 years ago. I knew him as a senator. I knew him when we were serving in the White House together, and a more tenacious advocate for American freedom at home and abroad. I don't think I'll ever know. But all through it, and you heard this a bit in the service today, there was that winsome sense of humor. Lindsey Graham is someone who he took the world seriously, but he did not take himself too seriously. And that was part of his magic.
Well, to that point then, is this the moment? Seeing all these, you were in the room with world leaders, with senators who are going to vote this evening on a Russia sanctions package, and a president of the United States who some think has wavered at times when it comes to Ukraine. What did today mean?
Well, I honestly hope that the greatest tribute to Senator Lindsey Graham will be when the Senate tonight begins the process of voting on tough new sanctions against Russia following that brutal and unprovoked invasion of 4 years ago. Literally, his last act was traveling to Kiev, meeting with President Zelenskyy, who I spoke to briefly today, thanking him for traveling to the funeral and acknowledging Senator Graham's contributions to the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. But my hope is that for all of the accolades that have been expressed about Senator Lindsey Graham, and they're all true, that what he would have hoped for the most is for our nation to impose the kind of sanctions, marshal the West again in support of Ukraine, and make it possible for the military of Ukraine to repel and defeat that Russian invasion and create the conditions for a lasting peace.
Well, and I wonder if you feel for President Zelenskyy and for Ukraine that they should feel in this moment more optimistic because of the prospect of this happening, or concerned that one of their fiercest allies, most tenacious, as you described him, in Lindsey Graham, is no longer there to liaise with the White House and with lawmakers here in Washington?
Well, I think it's a fair question, but what I've been very encouraged about is after some stops and starts early in this new Trump administration in support for Ukraine, in the last 6 months, we've seen President Trump and his national security team really begin to lean in support of Ukraine. The announcement of providing anti-ballistic missile technology, the Patriot missile technology, to Ukraine, I think sent a very important signal. I think, frankly, the fact that Ukraine in many ways has reinvented modern warfare with the use of drones, has been taking the fight directly to the mainland of Russia and even to the heart of Moscow, has created a new dynamic. But all along the way, I don't know for a fact, because I'm looking from the outside in, but I just have a sense that more than any other American, it was Senator Lindsey Graham's tenacious commitment to freedom, to understanding that the battle between Russia and Ukraine was really a frontier in the cause of freedom, and that America needed to stand with our ally, as did all of the West.
He was known as well as one of the biggest Iran hawks, if I can use that term, in Washington, and was celebrating the president for his decision to go in some 5 months ago now. I'm sure you're well aware that the pause is now days long. I just wonder your thoughts on this. If the president is reopening the peace process at the right time, or if we're talking with people who simply cannot be trusted.
Well, I was grateful for Senator Graham's efforts and the president's decision to strike Iran a year ago in Operation Midnight Hammer, and then to launch Operation Epic Fury. Our militaries responded brilliantly. And again, as the memorandum of understanding, almost disintegrated before the ink dried, I think President Trump rightly unleashed our military back against sites in Iran and let them know that if we have to settle this on the battlefield, we will. But I think so long as we maintain our force presence, and in fact, the administration has been growing our force presence in recent weeks, as long as we maintain that blockade, and my understanding is this new sanctions bill on Russia may well also include new sanctions on Iran. My hope is that we can get whoever it is that's in charge of Iran on any given day to finally come to the table and be willing to accept our conditions, which is abandon and dismantle their nuclear weapons program, ballistic missiles, end support for terrorism, and restore freedom of navigation in the Strait. President Trump's recent military action, a dozen days, I think sent the message that this pause is simply perhaps maybe one last opportunity for the Iranian government to recognize that we can do this the easy way at the negotiating table, achieving what we need to achieve for peace and security, or we will certainly allow the armed forces of the United States and our ally Israel to do it the hard way.
Well, I'm glad you raised Israel, because Netanyahu, the prime minister, did meet with the president at the White House today as well. There has obviously been something of a public rift between the two, or at the very least, President Trump has not shied away from sharp criticism of Netanyahu in Israel. And I wonder if you're concerned about the trajectory of that relationship. In your book, you write about not only how it's a conservative principle to pursue peace through strength, but also to stand by Israel, and if we're turning away from that in some way. Well,
I am concerned about it. On the progressive left, where even the voices of anti-Semitism have been accepted, even among public men and women. But on the populist right, we've seen people questioning America's support for Israel. But I have to tell you, I know President Trump better than his most ardent defenders. I've known Prime Minister Netanyahu for maybe 2 decades. Spoke to him briefly at the funeral today. We had a warm exchange. And while there can be periodic friction, I am very confident that this administration knows that if the world knows nothing else, the world should know this. America stands with Israel, and we always will.
Last time Benjamin Netanyahu was at the White House to meet with the president was only days before the U.S. began this operation. There have been questions about the photographs that we saw released from the prime minister's office showing a number of the president's top lieutenants, including the defense secretary, in the room with them today. Some wondered, is this a détente or a breakup? Will something important happen a couple of days from now that they've met again?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question. I spent a lot of time in that room, so I'm not in a position to speculate any more than you are. But
I'm not sure about that.
I think it's really up to the Iranians. You know, there's an old saying that once you're in conflict with another nation, the enemy has a vote.
Yes.
They opened the door to a memorandum of understanding that would achieve our objectives, which, as I said, are very clear: no nuclear weapons, no ballistic missiles, freedom of navigation, and no more support for terrorism. They had a shot. They blew it. They started to fire on vessels transiting the Strait, and the president responded with overwhelming force by the United States military. We control the airspace over Iran, even at this very hour. And I think whether or not we are back in military action in days or weeks will all depend on whether the Iranians come to their senses. But either way, I believe that if we cannot settle it at the negotiating table and achieve those specific goals and objectives, which are in the interest of the security of the region and the security of the American people, then I think we have to allow the armed forces of the United States and our ally Israel to finish the job.
Well, there also becomes a question of the costs associated and the funding that is necessary for that. The administration has made a supplemental funding request to Congress. Right. There is an effort through reconciliation to provide some money to the Pentagon. It's being complicated by the fact that the president also wants to see as much of the Save America Act passed as possible. And I wonder, given everything you were just saying about protecting Americans at home, trying to finish the job, if his goals here are working against one another, if you see it that way.
I don't, although I'm a strong supporter of the Save America Act. You know, it was probably 20 years ago that Indiana adopted voter ID. The very suggestion that having people show a picture ID when they vote discourages voting. I think Indiana in the past decade and a half has set records for the number of people participating in voting, and you know, more than 24 states have adopted voter ID with the same result. But I think, you know, there's no more important responsibility of the federal government than to provide for the common defense. And I think wherever the Save America Act settles out in this moment, I have every confidence that Republican majorities through the reconciliation process or otherwise are going to find a way to get our troops what they need and send a deafening message to our enemies in Iran and to potential adversaries around the world that America is going to remain strong.
Can I ask you, Mr. Vice President, about something that's going to be unfolding on Capitol Hill a bit later on? We have the Russia sanctions vote that we already described. There's also going to be an important vote on Todd Blanche's nomination. This could go into the next couple of days, we understand, to get the permanent role of Attorney General. We've got a couple of Republican senators who you know very well, in John Cornyn and Tom Tillis, who have issues with this idea of an anti-weaponization fund. They want it in writing that that's not going to happen. And this may well be held up for some time as a result. Are they on the right side of history with this?
Well, I was encouraged when the administration and the acting attorney general said that they had abandoned any plan to create a weaponization fund. I mean, I don't think people that assaulted police officers on January 6th should ever get a dime of taxpayer money.
I wouldn't think.
And, you know, I felt I still have great concerns about the president having pardoned people that engaged in violence against law enforcement and vandalism at our Capitol on that fateful day. But as I said, I'm encouraged that the acting attorney general has expressed a willingness to step back from that. I expect as the confirmation process goes forward that members of the Senate will get the answers that they need, and they'll vote accordingly.
Well, it wasn't just the anti-weaponization fund. It was also the immunity from audits for the president and his family that have caused issues. Do you believe that, too, should go away?
Well, I think it's all in the courts right now. I mean, I know we had one federal court decision that actually questioned whether or not the agreement was even justiciable when the same party is on both sides. Right. So I'll leave that question to the courts. But you know, I do recognize that the President of the United States, and I went through the confirmation process with a lot of our appointees. The President is entitled to the cabinet of his choosing. The role of the Senate is to advise and consent, and I expect that they'll do their job as always.
There's the matter of Jay Clayton as well. It looks like he will be confirmed, despite some very odd exchanges about the 2020 election that I suspect got your attention during his confirmation process. Do you trust him with the keys to our intelligence apparatus?
You know, I hold Jay Clayton in the highest personal regard. He's one of those names in the Justice Department that always resonated with both sides of the aisle, and I'm not surprised that he's getting the support that he's getting, and I would anticipate his confirmation forthwith.
All right, Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for sharing time with us today and coming straight from the memorial services from the late Senator Lindsey Graham. The former Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, with us here on Balance of Power. And we'll have much more ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us here on the Tuesday edition as we reflect on a memorial service today in town. We were just speaking with the former vice president about for the late Senator Lindsey Graham, with images we're showing you now on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube of the casket making its way into National Cathedral, which was teeming with not only family and friends, but of world leaders and, of course, a who's who of Washington politics. Having heard from a number of folks over the course of this hour, we turn to our political panel for some of their reflections with Democratic strategist Fred Hicks, founder of CEO of Hicks Evaluation Group, and Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, the founder and principal of Blue Stack Strategies. Maura, it was a bit of a throwback today for establishment Republicans. There were a lot of formers in the room. We just talked to one of them named Mike Pence. Might recall a different era for politics here in Washington. It's going to be hard to fill the shoes of Lindsey Graham, isn't it?
It really is. And I think that it's going to be hard to fill the shoes of leaders of the past. The version of Lindsey Graham that I remember, who was the close friend of John McCain, who understood and valued America's role in the world and really put that at the forefront of his career. I think, looking back on someone's life who was cut short in some ways, somebody who really cared about the job, who really cared about his public service over 30 years, both in military and as a public servant in Congress. That's something to be, respected and applauded. And I believe it's an interesting kind of time to look back on just the course of his time in office, but also what he has taken stands for and what he has, kind of taken a back seat to in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, he also, Fred, was someone who was willing to work across the aisle and did so. One of his last efforts really was to push this Russia sanctions package that he worked on with Senator Blumenthal. And the Senate will be trying to advance that in a procedural vote tonight. What testament does that serve to his legacy?
Well, to really just echo what Lindsey said, he is, legacy is the word that really comes to mind for Lindsey Graham. I lived in South Carolina during my teenage years, 8th grade through 10th grade, when Strom Thurmond was a senator, and Lindsey Graham, of course, succeeded Strom Thurmond in that position. And so you have two people who have a complicated legacy, some might say. But I think when you talk about Lindsey Graham, you think about the Save Russia Act, or not Save Russia, but this bill around Russia sanctions, and this is the trajectory of his career from a person who was a Trump critic to a Trump ally, and really kind of voting his convictions, whatever those were, and being willing, as Lindsey mentioned, like John McCain, at times reach across the aisle. That's something that I fear in the 2027 Congress will be lost in the Senate and on both sides, both chambers. And it is a loss for international diplomacy and American standing, I think, in the world to lose Lindsey Graham. Those are some tough and big shoes to fill that the Senate's going to, I hope, will take up and continue his legacy in that regard. Well,
if I could just step a little bit further into that complicated legacy, Maura, we have to remember that Lindsey Graham was a never-Trumper. He ran against Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and after he dropped out, he endorsed Jeb Bush and then Ted Cruz. I'm not sure if it was in that order, before he ever came around to Donald Trump, who spoke today about his decision to put Lindsey Graham's cell phone number on national television. I remember watching it live. I'm not sure he was ever able to use that phone again. But when we consider the trajectory from never-Trumper to full Trump loyalist, it is symbolic of the party at large, is it not?
It is. And I think one of the things that I was talking to some friends with who had worked on the Hill, who had worked for former Speaker John Boehner, kind of wondering, kind of lamenting that we'll never know the real reasons behind that flip, the real reasons that Lindsey Graham, kind of in some people's minds sold out. And, I think that's a shame, because I would have loved to hear what his real accounts were from that time period and what he was thinking and what he was going through, maybe personally, professionally, whatever it may have been. But we won't have that chance to know that And so unfortunately then becomes this legacy that gets written by us and by those who are closest to him, but maybe don't know the full story. And I do think that's a shame, because I am looking forward to the day when many people come forward and say why they decided to, maybe put their moral compass aside and go with what Donald Trump has put forward in a lot of ways. And that reckoning in terms of where do they stand now and how do they kind of square that with their own views and what they've purported to stand for. I'm disappointed we won't have that opportunity. And obviously it's disappointing just for the family and for his loved ones to be without him today and the days ahead.
Well, and as we consider those who gathered to memorialize the late Senator Fred, it obviously included many figures we know from domestic politics, but also many foreign figures as well, as we consider the lasting impact he'll have on American foreign policy. This was something that was touched on in the remarks made by both President Trump and Sean Hannity of Fox News around Lindsey Graham's push, or lack thereof, toward war. Listen to what they each had to say about it.
He was extremely hawkish. I will tell you, he never saw a war that he didn't like. Only his true friends would understand that, but he wanted it for the good of our country. He felt in his bones that our destiny is to win, and that his job was to do everything he could to ensure our enemies would lose.
Lindsey, he was often unfairly characterized as a warmonger. I've heard that false criticism a lot. It's not true. The truth was the opposite.
So I don't know, Fred, if you have an opinion on what was true here, but considering we do know that Lindsey Graham was a vocal advocate for this war with Iran, has his legacy even been fully shaped yet, as we're still mired in that conflict in the Middle East?
It is not. And again, I'm going to go back to the word that I just used, complicated legacy. As an elected official from the state, first and foremost, you're elected by the people and you have to represent your constituency, right? And he has one of the largest U.S. military training installations in the world in his state in Fort Jackson there in Columbia, South Carolina. And so to an extent, you can certainly understand why he would be interested in and a supporter of military engagement, as Fort Jackson is a large employer and it pours a lot of economic resources into the state of South Carolina. Also, when you think about the balance of the Senate overall, you have those who are more aggressive. You have those who are less aggressive on the foreign front. And I think it takes the combination of the 100 people in the Senate to really get us to where we need to go and where we should be. But with Lindsey Graham, again, given the South Carolina is in his state, you have the old, you have a lot of veterans there from Charleston Naval Base and the other installations across the state. It's not surprising at all that he would be pro foreign engagement, particularly given that there are Democrats and Republicans alike who ascribe to the philosophy of strength through through military force. And so, how you see him really depends on your angle with respect to that. But I do think that the way I would see him, the way I would describe him as it relates to foreign affairs, and as someone who's studied a lot of international affairs, is that he was aggressive, but he had his moments of tempering that. So he understands, like Republicans used to, that a strong Russia is not necessarily good for the rest of the world. And so, that adds to the complicated legacy.
All right, Fred Hicks and Maura Gillespie, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, for more coverage of the late senator and everything happening here in Washington, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.